1.5 years ago at the last conference, I talked about the hidden gems of AnyLogic. So little tiny helpers that lots of people forget about was just a reminder to the community. Like, there's so many tiny cool features in AnyLogic, don't forget about it. Purpose of this talk is a little different in that how do you actually build good models? How do you ensure that as your model grows, it doesn't become unwieldy? So it's all about, no, it's not about Industry 4.0. I had to put it in there because Andre was forcing me. No, it's all about cleaning up, making sure your model works fine. So a little bit about me. I started using AnyLogic almost 10 years ago. It'll be a big celebration next year when I turn 10. And I've been using the tool all the time. So I've seen a lot. I've went deep, especially during my PhD. But what I'm interested in is you guys. So I typically, I used to give training courses in AnyLogic for a couple of years, so to complete beginners. And I typically say that people who use AnyLogic between 0 and 8 weeks, I would count that as an AnyLogic beginner. So who is brave enough to admit that he's an AnyLogic beginner? Okay, that's about, that's about like a quarter. So what about the people who have used AnyLogic between 8 weeks and 2 years, roughly? Okay, that's maybe a little less than that. So that is where I see people sort of getting to grips with the tool, understanding the core concepts, and also seeing some of the pitfalls that are in the tool. So I consider you advanced users. And who's used AnyLogic for more than 10 years, except for the developers? A couple of hands, so you are the cracks. So the way I structure this talk is that I want to make sure that you will write this down on a board. You will adopt best practices. I'm not going to make you say it out loud altogether, so don't worry. So the vision is that a world would be great where people would actually follow best practices, right? Who of you has been unfortunate enough and was forced to take over a model from another person? Vito was unfortunate enough to take over my models. Apologies again. So a couple of hands. To those of you who haven't had that experience yet, it's not pleasant most of the time. Because creating an AnyLogic model is a very personal affair. If somebody has to look up my model, I always feel a little bit like the person is looking under my skirt or something. It's very personal, very intimate. So when you look at somebody else's model, you often find, oh my God, what the hell was that all about? I don't understand what's going on. I don't understand why the person did it that way. And most of the time, there's no documentation or anything. So again, the purpose of this talk is to help the unfortunate souls who have to do that have a better experience in the future, so the people that take over your models, but also who has built a model, then went away for a couple of weeks and had to come back to his own model and was completely stunned. Who's had that experience? All right, so that's a lot more hands there. So again, the purpose of this talk is to help you smooth that experience out a little bit as well. So the way it's going to work is I will basically mention lots of little ideas and best practices one after the other. I organized it. We start with a couple of ideas for beginners, for advanced people, and for cracks. And towards the end, we're going to have some philosophical musings as well, because some things are not, you just cannot say it's black or white. So we're going to chat a little bit about that. What I would suggest is, actually also for the people with the microphones, I think it's good if we have questions in between, because I'm going to talk about a lot of points. And if there's something that you don't understand, or you actually want to comment about, I would ask you to just straight away ask the question, so we can make it a little interactive. What you will find, especially if you're advanced or crack, is that some of the things I'm saying, you'll probably either think that's completely trivial, which is fine, or you might also say, I completely disagree. What the hell is he talking about? And that's when I want to see the hand. That's the most interesting thing. Good. Any comments, questions before we start? All right. So I'm not going to do much coding here, so I'm going to do most of the talking. So let's start with beginner ideas. Things that you can start from day one. So this is my daughter actually learning to paint. And look at the beautiful painting that she's doing on the paper and everywhere else. When I teach people AnyLogic and they sort of attend the training course and show me the kind of initial models they've built, it sometimes feels like that to me. You know, I see the model and it's all over the place. So what I want to help you do is just like a kid learns painting, building AnyLogic models is a little bit like painting. It's a little bit like art. So you can make a model look like that, but you can also make it look like, not Picasso, some nice picture. Good. There was one super important lesson, and I almost forgot to put it into the presentation. I just remembered this morning. And it's the most important thing I want you to take away from this. So if it's only one thing, it's this one. What's the most important thing when it comes to model building? Any idea?
Names to the variables.
Exactly. No, I'm kidding. That's really important as well. But it's more of a philosophy. So in this conference, we saw lots of amazing models. Like my impression was much more complex than in the past conferences, which is great to see. But I sit there, see the complex models, and think, did these guys build that right away? Like, you know, the steel plant model from Goldrod. It's like so many things. Did you just start drawing it? And you know? So the most important lesson in model building, if you're a beginner, is you have to start simple. So don't build models like that, which you might have seen on the internet. That's like a system dynamics approach to Afghanistan stability. And people were commenting on it, like, how is a US president supposed to understand that? I think that was given to Obama at some point. So you shouldn't build a model like that. You should always start simple. And that's the single most important lesson, the single most important best practice that you should adopt. If your client or whoever wants a model of reality, do not build reality. The first thought is, how can I build the simple-most version of reality? And typically, when I work at McKinsey, I try to have a model by the end of 1 week that has the entire system in there already, but everything super simplified. So if it's about Afghanistan stability, I want to have the Afghan population, I want to have some, you know, how they react to some policy, whatever, some economy stuff. I want to cover the entire solution space already, but everything extremely simplified. And then from then on, it's really just adding detail here, adding detail there, making it more and more complex, and keep testing, obviously. So that really, there's already one comment, brilliant. But for me, that's the most important thing. That's what I try to drill into people that I teach. And very often, people nod and see the point and don't do it. So Amy, what do you have to say? There's a microphone.
I agree with that, keeping it simple. I just want to add, I think a way to keep it simple is maybe one step ahead of that is making sure you're always focusing on what's the purpose of the model.
Yep.
And once you have that purpose statement, then it's easier to keep it simple because you can always come back and say, that detail is not relevant for our purpose. So
yep.
Just wanted to add that
very,
that's
very
a good
good point.
Way to keep
That's even before you start modeling, absolutely. Go to your client and really tease out what question do you want to answer. In the Decision Lab presentation, there was like the exam question, and that's a really good way to frame it. Tease out the exam question from your client, and then you can use that all the way during your project to sort of keep improving your model. Good. But now to some more ideas for beginners, things that you can start from day one. There is one simple tool in AnyLogic. It's called the view area. So I want you to befriend the view area and use it a lot. So people always in AnyLogic, you know, you drag and drop objects and it gets bigger and bigger and you have lots of different things and you have some animation and you have the process chart and you have some variables and functions. A very good practice right from the start is that you start to organize your model from day one. And what I do is I have several view areas in each agent, typically one for animation. So all the animation I put inside that view area. I have one for the logic. I have one for the functions and variables. And I don't pan around while I develop the model. And I also don't allow my clients or the model users to pan around. I only allow them to have a user interface where they can click on a menu and then the model jumps to that menu. So when they click on logic, it takes them to the logic view area part. And for me, that really panned out over the years. Panning makes you inefficient, and it's a really quick fix. So it's a really beginner little trick. And building on that, you need to become a stacking artist. And what I mean by that is that it's a tiny thing, but I really just had the insight a couple of weeks ago. My view areas, I stack them on top of each other. So I don't, in the design frame, I don't put them left and right of each other, always below each other. Any idea why? You can scroll with your mouse, exactly. It's as simple as that. And it's a time saver. It saves a lot of time, especially when your models get really big. Good. So you can see I'm what's the word? A little autistic when it comes to model building. I like it clean, I like it organized, I like it structured. One additional thing there is that you should really fall in love with colors. Just like my daughter painting her pictures. So AnyLogic has really, really great tools that you drag and drop, like this state chart, like the action chart, which is like an algorithm visualized. All the animation blocks, stuff like that. Get into the habit of actually coloring these things. They all can be colored with different colors. And they all have a default color. If you drag it in, state charts are always yellow, action charts are always green. And I have like a little inbuilt theme of how I color things already. So states, for example, that just initialize some data or not really important, I just make them gray. Then states that represent like a failure of some component, I make them red. States that represent an agent actually doing the stuff it's supposed to do, I do it green. Again, a tiny thing, but underrated, because if somebody looks at the model, be it the client or the poor soul after you who has to develop the model, there is some inherent understanding already, which is color-based. So do yourself the favor, do him the favor. All right, so now you might be thinking, I feel depressed. That is so sad. What the hell is he talking about? Anybody knows Marvin? Cool. So Marvin is from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He's a robot from the future who has personality. So he is the impersonation of AI, and he's always depressed because he has this brain the size of the universe, but he asks himself, what's the point? Now, incidentally, in AnyLogic, there's one thing that's often overlooked, which begs exactly the same question. What's the point? And I'm talking about the description tab. Who has never heard about the description tab? Especially advanced users. OK, good. That's already good. So every object in AnyLogic in the properties has one tab, which says description. And what you should put in there is something very specific. You should not put in there what this is. So like here I have a variable, and I see people writing in there, this is the variable that stores the value 12 or something. And that is completely useless because I can see that it's a variable storing the value 12. So what you need to put in there is, why are you there? What's the purpose? What's the point? It's so critical. And also, who are you? Which is essentially the same thing. So what I try to teach people is, when I go into their model and I click on something, that's the question I have. What is this doing here? Why is it here? Sometimes it's also useful to put in like who's calling that, or where is it used, what is it used for, but that's not so critical. The critical thing is, why are you here? A couple of more things you might, if you can see the text there are a few little tricks in the description tab. So there are what's called a Java doc kind of functionality. So at the bottom two lines, you may see there's something weird, like it's an @ sign, an @ author, and then my name, and @ since with a date. And then a couple of more of those handles that are really useful because you can use them. The @ author is basically a key in AnyLogic where you sign. So whatever you do, you sign with your name or your email address. So in the future, everybody knows who did that, and also when did he do that. So it's really, really useful when several people work on a model. It's also useful for clients getting back to having a question, and they can immediately see this guy actually did that. There are a couple of more of these Javadoc handles. And the point here is that when you actually write code and you use the beautiful code complete functionality, you get a little help window that shows the text that you put in the description, and it also formats it nicely. So you can see the since with the date, the author, that's the stuff I was putting in there before. Here we have 2 more things, parameters and returns, which is for functions. And you can read about that in the AnyLogic help. But again, this is a best practice you can do from day one, and I urge you to do it. And the takeaway lesson is, write why is this thing here. Don't write what. The why is important. I just taught a client AnyLogic, and he was one of those people who doesn't like to document. Because when you build the model, you know the model. It's in your brain. It's so intuitive. I know why the variable is there. And it was really hard to convince him to do that, and I had to force him to do that. And then a couple of weeks later, he was sending the model to me with a question like, Ben, I don't understand why this isn't working. Can you have a look? And I had a look, and sure enough, the kind of thing I had to look into were undocumented or really badly documented things. So I had to go back to him and basically say, that you would make my life so much easier if you had documented it the way I taught you to. So very, very important. Get into that habit. Cool. Now everything turns dark. Let's put some light in here again. It's my daughter again. She's painting again, so you can see the painting is getting better now. What I want you to learn or get into the habit to hear is that you need to start to capture your learnings. Who has a formalized approach already of capturing his AnyLogic learnings in some way, shape, or form? Okay, so that's maybe 5% or 10% of the people. Cool, so that tells me this is not in vain. Good. So I've used AnyLogic for 10 years, and at the start I didn't do any of that as well. I just coded away. But I used the support. So shout out to the support people. It's a great support. They basically answer every question. And with the hundreds of questions I've asked over the years, 99% of them were solvable, and only some really weird stuff we didn't actually get to solve. Now, I started very early on to capture what they told me and store it. Because first, I don't have to ask it again. And also, I do it in a way that I can retrieve it really easily. So I use Dropbox Paper, but there are other tools like Evernote, or you can just put it in an Excel file or a Word document. It really doesn't matter. Something where you can search for keywords. So what I do when I need to know something, I go into Dropbox Paper, and there's a search, and I type the keyword. So very often, I ask myself, how do I convert strings to integers, for example? That kind of age-old question, which I'm not prepared to keep in mind. So I go into Dropbox Paper and just type convert into string, and I see the AnyLogic support reply. Right? So that is immensely useful, and over the years you build up something very valuable. I should probably compile mine into a book and sell it at some point, because there's so many nuggets in there. So do get into the habit of creating your own knowledge base. Then, yeah, that's what I meant, store your support answers. There's also one more dimension of capturing your learnings, and we already heard it a couple of times here and there, and that's that you should create something like a base model. So no matter if you work for a consulting firm or for your, for an industrial firm or whatever, it is very good practice to have one model that you always start from when you create a new model. So that should include like the corporate animation, like a PowerPoint template essentially. But also more advanced things like some unit testing might be in there, some integration testing, some core functions that you always use, like conversion functions or stuff like that. So you don't have to rewrite those again and again. It's a very simple approach. Even beginners can do it. If you're more advanced, then you can start looking into creating your own library. But just creating your own base model is a very simple and effective way to save time if you build lots of models over time. Cool. So that is the kind of ideas I have for beginners. Let's go a little deeper into the dream and go into the advanced modes. So we already talked about the description tab and commenting. And I see lots of people who are Java cracks, get into AnyLogic, and basically are of the opinion that their code is self-documenting, which ideally it is. If you're a really good coder, you write Java code, and it basically describes itself. It's awesome. But it basically never is, because you don't know who else is looking at the code in the future. It might not be a Java crack, but it might also be yourself, and you're stuck again. So please comment your code. 3 things that I applied is 3 different ways of commenting. So there's one way in Java where you have the slash and the star, and then you close that, and you can basically write over several lines, and it formats in green. So in the screenshot in the code, you can see that's sort of greenish. So you can quickly see that it's a comment. And I use sections to sort of really, it's like a chapter heading. I say, now I start something very new, very big, and this is what comes below. Then the second way is that you just use 2 slashes, which just is 1 line of comment. And I typically use that like above an if function or above a for loop to just say, this if function or this for loop is here because. And again, that folds back into the why. Don't tell me that it's an if function looping through X, Y, Z. That's the self-documenting of the code. I can see that. But just a quick reminder for myself, why is this here? So I can scan through the code very quickly and efficiently. And then there's a third way that I use is, again, the double slashes, but at the end of a line of code. So not starting a new line. And you can see it there in line 3, I did that. And I typically use that for a very small comment, something like the unit. When I converted a unit in that line, I'm just saying converting from kilograms to grams or something like that. That helps me massively if you work with physical models or financial models and you need to keep track of units. It's a tiny little thing. And if you formalize that and teach your colleagues to do that and everybody follows a similar approach, it doesn't have to be that one, then you're also in a really good shape. So I recommend having one approach. So when I asked what's the most important thing, the most important best practice, Andre said, naming your things, right? So I got a picture for you on that one as well. If you're not following the correct naming conventions, that's a paddling. So Angry Simpson guy really wants you to use naming conventions. Again, that might be the second most important thing I want to take you away. Adopt a naming convention. Everybody in coding does it. There are standard Java naming conventions. There's standard naming convention for Python. There is not a standard simulation naming convention because there's so many different tools in different languages. But first of all, obviously, you should follow Java standards. They're fairly intuitive and easy to learn. But what I learned is some really good ideas for AnyLogic naming. And that's mostly due to my last boss at Decision Lab, Dave Buxton, who taught me that, and it's a really good idea. Sorry? Oh, bad guys. So just for the microphone, Vito was saying at the company where the guy taught me this, they're not using it anymore for the reason that with code complete, you can see if it's a function or not. But let's step back and I actually tell you why you still should use it. The way that we do it, or that I recommend doing it, is that you have one letter that basically defines what type of object it is. So for variables, it's v underscore. For functions, it's f underscore. For parameters, p underscore. For process library objects, pl, whatever. Obviously, you can just do your own little abbreviation. But there are 3 really good reasons why you should do it. So first of all, it helps when you do the code complete stuff. And Vito was saying they're not doing it anymore because when you do code complete, you see if the object is a function or not. But what you don't see is if you don't use that and you have 2 functions or hundreds of functions, often I need a function. I can't quite remember the name, but I know it's a function. So please list me all the functions that there are. And if you do f underscore, you get all the functions. Whereas if you don't follow that, then, and you don't remember the name, which is really, really common with big models, then you're stuck. So go back, do it again. It also helps debugging. So if you use the debugger, which I come to later, it's really useful, and you look into an agent and you want to see what's that agent doing at the moment, the way the debugger works is that it lists all things within the agent alphabetically. And if you know I want to check out variable X, then with the alphabetical sorting, you get all variables below each other. So it's very easy to jump to all the variables and see what the variable value is, same for parameters and whatever. So it helps there as well, yes?
Sitting together with Nikolai, and we, as we all know, are same geeks as you, right? So we have a different view on this. So this is a convention that existed, I think, in the 90s for C++ coding, right?
Okay.
Yep. So kind of more, well, to us, the more modern approach is that no prefixes, no underscores, no prefixes, no underscores, and function name is definitely a verb or a question. It like starts with, if it's Boolean, it starts with is.
Set, is,
right?
get.
Yeah, or get or set, etc. And a variable is definitely a noun, right? And maybe Nikolai, can you comment on?
Yeah, variable is a noun, and almost in all the cases, I think it's no difference. So which actually this variable is. So if it names describes what is variable, what does it carry? No matter whether it's collection or parameter or simple variable, so you just you use this variable, you use this name and refer to the object.
Yeah, but anyway, if it helps, well, anything that helps you to kind of organize, to remember where's what, is definitely useful. Yeah, and I don't know if you're gonna tell this or not, but they kind of capitalize the class names. That's the last thing we wanted to see. Comment on that. The class name and
yes.
Capital letter. That's thanks.
Yeah. So these are like you should follow the standard Java convention, which is using verbs for functions and stuff like that. And also, if you have several words in one name, then you start with lowercase, and then the new word is uppercase. And if it's a class, it should start with an uppercase. But that's typical Java thing.
We do a little bit of a hybrid. Our functions, we use the action words, but we firmly believe in putting the the variable naming. We take it a little bit farther than V. We'll say I for integer, D for double, B for Boolean, and that really also helps with the code complete, just what you said. I don't remember what I named this variable, but I know it's a Boolean. We type B and it comes right up. And my background's in industrial engineering, so maybe I need that. Maybe you guys don't need it as much as I do, but I find it very helpful to do that kind of sorting.
Thank you.
Love it. So you can see different approaches, different ideas. This is what I would recommend to beginners and advanced users, but it really depends on what you feel comfortable with and what your experiences are. But it also helps Joe. Don't forget about Joe. Joe's the guy that takes over the model from you. So he might not know the 200 function names that you had there, and he can't remember them. So if it's F-score, code complete, he sees them all. Cool. Oh, Andre has one more comment. Great. This is really good.
So I think that there is one very important thing here is, regardless of what coding conventions or naming conventions you stick to, it should be consistent. Like if you decided to use the term inventory, you should never use the term stock on hand, for example, somewhere else, right? Yeah. And you should always be consistent both with the format of how you name your functions and variables, and with the terminology itself. For example, if you if you have chosen to use the acronym for something, like SOH for stock on hand, you should always stick to using the stock on hand and never stock on hand.
Yeah.
So that the consistency here is the key thing, not the, I think, not the convention itself.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And one really good idea on that point would be put that into your base model. That's what it's for, right? Put the conventions in there. You can actually write them in a text object and say, stock on hand should always be named SOH, things like that. And you got it all in one place. Was there one more comment? Otherwise, I would go to the next.
I have to say that I've been doing software development for like 20 years, and there are standards on the internet for doing this. It's not something you make up. It's something that we all agree to do.
For simulation modeling?
Yeah, I mean, for software, I mean, you're talking about Java, C#, C++, whatever. This is not anything that's rocket science. It's a standard like IEEE, and if you're a good software developer, you will use that. So I agree with you in naming the variables.
Yeah.
It's been a standard for a long time.
Okay, this is a bad software developer perspective. I'm using the Rail library, which requires lots of functions, variables, and this and that to control everything. So I've got more than 20 functions and more than 60 variables, 13 different parameters just stacked up on my main screen. So that P underscore, V underscore, F underscore, that structure helps me a lot. Particularly differentiating between the parameters and the variables, which almost look like same, but how say it, function like same, but are totally different stuff. So I'm totally with you.
Really good discussion. I enjoyed that. That's great. Good. Let's move on. So naming convention, get one, and apply it and be consistent. Let's look at Volcanoes. Can you actually read it? Fjalla, blah, blah, blah. Anybody can pronounce that? You know, remember the Iceland volcano a couple of years ago exploding? So let's say we are simulation modelers and you're supposed to build a model for some volcanic activity. What's the impact on flights and economy and volcanoes? Now, what's the problem there? What do you think? Sorry? Yes, in terms of best practices, so yeah, there are lots of things to consider when you actually build that specific model, but I don't like that name, and I don't want to type it ever. So what you need to get into the habit to is to fear strings in your model. You know, very often you send messages between agents and things like that, and often people send string messages like, dear agent, come to me, or I'm ready, you can come collect me, or something like that. And what I found over the years and what I tell people is, right from the start when you build a model, even if you're in a hurry, don't use strings. So when you build a volcano model, you should do something else. You should use either Java enumerations or AnyLogic option lists, where you basically type it once into a list of volcanoes, and then you have that forever. So you don't ever have to type that again. You can basically access Fjolla blah 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 as OL option or option list volcanoes.ar da da da. So when you send messages where the volcano says, hey, I'm exploding, it would basically send a message with that, not with a string. And the reason, I hope, is obvious, because when you develop your model over weeks and months, you will forget the strings. And very often, like you start with a string like come collect me, and 3 weeks later, you actually another agent has to do the same message, send the same message, and you don't write come collect me, you say please collect me. And that could already break everything. So the consistency is also really important when it comes to message passing, when it comes to different dimensions in your model. So my recommendation is right from the start, for each dimension, you should create an option list or an enumeration. So there is a question there. So like for volcano, I would always have a list of volcanoes. For aircraft engines, I would have a list of the engines that I am actually considering. Truck types, whatever, disease types. Whenever you have one new dimension, create an option list. Yes?
Yeah, so I agree with you totally. I've had another issue where if you get a spelling error, it's not checked by the code complete, right?
Exactly.
So you don't get a compile error.
Yes.
And you debug for hours, and somewhere you just had a minor spelling error, and suddenly that message was not sent. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Cool. So that was a quick one.
Ben, can I add something?
Yes,
So
please.
if you define them as enumerations, you can also define this toString method for this enumeration,
Yeah.
and you have you can have for every member of this enumeration, you can have a nice human-friendly description as a toString, and you can use it while logging
Yeah.
or outputting somewhere to user interface, etc.
Cool. And the one other thing I was going to mention to that is that in your input database, when you use the AnyLogic database, like in the column Volcanoes, typically you would make that a string type column, but you can actually make it a column of type option list Volcanoes, and then you have the drop-down option when you create a new entry or when you load data from your Excel table, it actually checks, is it the same string? Or if there's a new string, somebody typed it wrong in the Excel, it's going to be an empty field. So you have that type safety, or I'm not sure if that's the right word, but you basically ensure that you never mess up with type errors. Cool. Now, let's go beyond geek and go into the really advanced stuff. We have heard the word Git already, version control. Definitely recommended. So who builds models, and when they save it into a new folder, version 1, version 2, version 3? Nobody? Oh yeah, a couple of people, good. So I'm fully with you. That's surprisingly many companies still do that. I see that at clients, and I see it at our firm as well. Version control is super powerful because you don't have to create lots of folders. You basically have one history of your model, and whenever you commit something to that version, to that history, you can say what you actually changed. So you can say, I added feature X or removed feature Y. If you're a sole developer, if you develop the model alone and you're the only one working on it, you can just have like one master branch. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, then just read up on version control and you'll learn what that really is. The way I work, I typically develop models myself. I have one master branch, but whenever I start a new feature, I create a new feature branch off of that, do my feature, and then merge it back into the master branch when I'm done. It's just a cleaner way to do it. Once you get into the version control thing, it's a nicer way to document what you've actually done. And it's also easier to roll back things and say, yeah, that was the wrong approach, I'll just start from scratch. But version control, you can take it to extremes. So the Decision Lab guys have mentioned something really interesting, which is co-development. So several people working on the same model at the same time. Now, there is the painful way where you have one AnyLogic model file, one ALP file, and people basically work off of that. So I start working on it in the morning. I create a Ben branch and do all my work on the Ben branch. And Andre works on the Andre branch. And at the end of the day, we basically try to merge it back together. And that's really painful because, as Vito was saying earlier, you basically have one big, long XML file. It is possible. It's probably a good experience because you learn Git really well in merging and solving conflicts. But it's not very efficient. So either you adopt a way where you stay out of each other's way. So I say to Andre, you work on agent X today, I work on agent Y, please don't touch my agent. And when you do, please give me a call or something so we can merge beforehand, do that. That's a little more efficient. Or you go all the way, which is what the Decision Lab guys are doing, and actually have several ALP files where each file represents one piece of your model that a separate developer would work on. The downside there is that you have some upfront work to do with message passing and setting interfaces between those things. So I would recommend that if you know we're going to work on this model for a while, at least a couple of weeks, and we know that several people will continuously work on that model, and it's a brilliant approach. You should definitely do that. But if it's only for a couple of days, then it might be overkill. Would you guys agree? Is that roughly good recommendation? Cool. Good. Oh, there's one comment here.
Feature toggle management, where you set a flag and at runtime you can change that flag and make the code go through different branches, so you don't have the problem of having to merge different parallel development efforts which create trouble at merge time.
You mean like
So
a
you
microservice kind of
Yeah, you
development?
just create lots of feature flags. And now there are tools which will actually automate the feature flag management for you. So you will have there's an outfit called split.io, which basically does that and lets you change the toggles at runtime and system can behave differently.
Okay, that sounds really cool. I'd love to learn more about that. I'd love to be able to do that in AnyLogic at some point. So yeah, maybe you can tell me more about that later. Good, next one. The database. Who's used the database and has been bumped because it doesn't give you the right kind of data? Like you make the right query and it should work and the data is there, but it's not doing it in the model. So you've been there, I've been there. Maybe it was just me, I didn't have much knowledge about databases when AnyLogic introduced it, but there's one caveat that you need to be aware about, and that's cached versus non-cached database values. So by default, when you query the database, it gives you the cached data to be faster. So when the model starts, it caches everything, and then when you query something, it gives you that cached data. What I often do is I actually change data at runtime because something important changed. You shouldn't do that a lot, but sometimes it's the best way to do it. And then I need that data back, and I ask the database, and it took me a few days to figure this one out. I didn't figure it out. The support figured it out for me. There's one tiny little command, and that's the false. When you have a query, and you actually want to get data, there's a hidden Boolean argument that you don't typically get. So typically you write the lower line when you use the really cool query wizard. There's a little button in AnyLogic that lets you write those automatically. You never see that there is actually another parameter, a Boolean parameter. So being aware of that is really useful because if you use it and set it to false, you get the non-cached version and it actually digs into the database. That for me was an eye-opener. Cool. Put this guy in as well. Okay, lunch is over, but message passing is really important. That goes back to what we discussed before with the volcanoes. You know, when you whisper things, it's like writing the wrong thing. So good message passing is an art in itself. So we already covered that you should use option lists or enumerations, so you avoid mistyping things. But there's more to it. So you should do it right. Avoid strings, we said that. What I like to do when I pass messages is I often send the agents themselves. I don't send string messages. So if one agent wants to be collected by another agent, I just send the initial agent, and that the other agent knows I need to collect this guy now. So the agent himself becomes a message, which has advantages because you can access what the agent is. But you can also go beyond that and create your own message class, where the different dimensions are where's the message coming from, where's the message going to, maybe what is the message, and you can go into all sorts of complexity there depending on what kind of system you model. So I think this is a really good idea for more complex models where you have a standard approach to message passing, you just create your own class and you can control that fully. Now, the world's most accurate pie chart. What I'm saying here is that the AnyLogic charts go some way, and we've seen some models where they've been used really, really well and really creatively. But you couldn't go well beyond that, and lots of people are surprised by what you can actually do with AnyLogic visually. So this is still based on the AnyLogic 8.2 kind of Java approach, where you can basically be completely flexible in how you animate your model. So you can have all sorts of charts and sort of a menu structure, and it can look like Star Trek. So this is actually based on some McKinsey designer guys designing a really cool user interface, and I basically putting it into AnyLogic and making it interactive. So just be aware that you're not limited by what AnyLogic gives you. You can be super creative, and typically this is worth a lot. because a client that sees a model and likes it intuitively because it looks good trusts it more. You might say I'm a superficial management consultant or whatever. It just is true. And also, with this model, I built it myself, big fat complex mining model. I put in my usual normal sort of AnyLogic UI. And then the partner said, yeah, cool model, but it looks, well, he said a bad word. And I felt like, oh, he knows my work. And then we put in the designer on it, and they helped us do that. And now I see the model, and I think this was such a good push. Like, I like the model much better, and I feel much more comfortable working with it, and I'm proud of it. So it's a good thing. Like, get to know how you can animate beyond the standard capability. You can do so much more. Cool. Good. Let's go into some philosophy. So the kind of things I've mentioned so far are really mostly things that are more or less undisputed. So you saw some things people have an opinion about, but for example, naming conventions, everybody agrees you need to have one. So, but here I've got a couple of things that are not so clear-cut. For example, when do you use functions versus action charts? So if you don't know, an action chart, that's like the thing on the right-hand side. It's a visual algorithm. So you can either write an algorithm directly in a function, writing the Java code, or you can drag and drop a couple of action chart objects and do the same thing. Now, we've got one question here. So I typically recommend that for small things, you use functions. For small things, for unimportant things, you use functions. For things that the client or user is never going to be asking about, you use functions, because it saves a lot of space, and you can just read the code and document it well. But for action charts, I recommend you use it for critical algorithms. So when it comes to decision-making of some important steel plant operators, that's what the client is going to ask about. Why did he decide X, Y, Z? And if you have that in an action chart, it's really powerful because you can show it to the client directly at runtime or during the development. Yeah, this is how he decides. And if this happens and if that happens, but the downside is it eats a little bit of your space. So it's really a call when to do it and when not, yes?
If the functionality, the function or the action chart will be called multiple times, which way is faster?
Ooh, I don't know. Do you guys know? No difference, cool. Perfect, that's how it should be. Good, another one, hardcoding versus data-driven. So what I mean by that is when you do your volcano model, very often you just get into it, you want results quickly. Somebody says a volcano erupts every 60 years or something, and you just write that into the model. Every 60 years, please volcano erupt. Whereas a data-driven approach would be, yeah, 60, but that might be something that you actually want to play with later on. So it should actually be an input. And when I teach modeling to people, what I see is that beginners typically hardcode a lot, and more advanced people typically do a data-driven approach much more. And I think there is a balance, because if you do full data-driven, everything is some parameter, some input, that's not super helpful as well. So for me, there's a balance. I typically, things I know we want to play with, okay, that's going to be data-driven, that's going to be a parameter. Things I think we'll probably not play with, but at some point we might, I don't hard-code it. You should actually never hard-code anything, like never write a 12 somewhere in the model. I use a constant, so you can drag in a variable and tick a little button and make it a constant, and that basically indicates this is a number that can never be changed. And you document it well, and you say this is 12 because it's 12, and that gives you a nice way to not hard-code, but also not make it flexible, because not everything should be data-driven. Again, it's a balance. Oh, that's the best picture on hard coding. I love this one. This is so good, isn't it? Everybody who does coding understands that straight away. And that's data-driven, can do anything. All right, let's skip the last musing, and let's just come to an end because the time's up and you guys want to catch your flight. So I hope this was helpful. I really enjoyed the discussion. If you want, you can connect. I've got a website. I have a blog, but it's a little on sleep while I work at McKinsey. The big thing is the podcast. So a guy named Stephen Ingalls started the Sim Talk podcast just recently. It's just the first episode out. So you can look it up on iTunes or wherever. And it's great. I think it's a really, really good thing to bring the simulation community closer together. I love listening to podcasts. If you don't, it's basically like an interview format. So he interviews people for like an hour, and they just chit-chat about simulation. And it's not AnyLogic related, so it's really the simulation community. He's a Simio guy, so there's lots of interesting things that can come out of that. And we're also going to do like a mini version of that. So he's going to have his interviews, 1 hour interviews, but I'm going to do some mini episodes, like 5-minute quick pieces of information, like the mini things I fed you here. Just talking about specific things. So if you have any ideas of what you want to explain, like can you explain to me what discrete event modeling is or something like that, then do reach out. If you have good ideas for what we would cover, that would be great. If you want to be on the podcast and actually chat to Steve and share your view of the world, by all means, reach out as well. He'd be very happy to have you. So that's a cool thing. I love that. And with that, thanks a lot for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it. Any more questions, final questions or comments? Yes.
Maybe just a quick observation about we want people to use the models and get value from the models. And even if we create simple user interfaces, a lot of simple things can become complicated again. So we've been starting a practice of recording little YouTube videos of showing the users how to work with the model.
Yeah.
Right. And it saves us a huge amount of time because it's literally you in front of your video camera for an hour rather than writing piles and piles of documentation that nobody reads. So just maybe a recommendation to do more of those YouTube videos to show how the model works and the value that you can get from it.
I've done that as well, actually. It's a really good point. And what I found is it's better to have lots of small videos, just like AnyLogic guys do that. They have lots of really short videos. So how do I start the model? What does it menu do? So they can look up what they actually need. Yeah, but that's a really cool point. Having interactive model documentation is helpful. What I also found is make it easy for the client when he uses the model and he has a specific question on a button. I usually put like a little question mark, and if he clicks on it, he gets a little pop-up explaining to him what that is. Because often it's very specific questions that they have. So that's another thing for model documentation that you can do. Thanks. Good. Cool. Well, get home safe.